Hey guys, I'm Alan Mendoza. I'm a third year FMS major and a Digifilm minor. Today we're going to be talking about camera work, and right now we're shooting on the C100 Mark II. It's loaned out from FMS department. I've worked with this camera a couple times in Digifilm and also at work. Also a couple times I've taken it out to work on other projects like 120A projects, 190 projects. So yeah, I've used it a couple times. It's a pretty good starter kit for a cinema camera. So when picking up a camera, the thing I've seen the most that I want people to kind of be aware of, always check white balance. That's something that I've seen quite a bit of that's been mishandled. So you just gotta, white balance just makes sure that your camera's picking up the measurement of the light source that's in your area within the shot. So you just gotta make sure you check beforehand, make sure it's at the right color temperature. Right now, daylight, 56. Since it's a little cloudy, you could go a little bit above that, 5600. Or you could do daylight. If we were inside, we do 3200. So that's like more tungsten light. Over here it's daylight, so we have bluish, more softer light. Another thing, just make sure you have enough batteries before you head out on any shoot. The worst thing that could happen is that you run out of batteries when you're out on a shoot. There's not really anything you can do. With the C100, you could plug in a DC, but if you're shooting on a DSLR or something like that, you're out of luck. So just make sure you have your batteries. Aperture is also a big thing. A lot of people are confused about why they aren't getting certain looks from shots. If you want a shallower, creamier background look with a focus on your subject, you do a lower aperture. So you need a faster lens, basically. Just ones that open up more. If you want more of a deep focus look that has everything in focus, you're gonna have to up your aperture a couple stops. So aperture is basically it basically measures how wide your lens closes or opens. So let's say you have a 1.8, like this lens here, the Sigma 18-35. This is a 1.8 constant aperture lens, so it'll stay at 1.8 no matter if I'm at 18 or 35. Basically what that means is it's pretty good in low light. The iris will open up to 1.8 and it'll stay there no matter what. And from there you can point it at something and get a really creamy bokeh look on your subject. If you were to get let's say this lens here, this is the 24-105, you'll basically get everything in focus most of the time. Unless you're really zoomed into a subject, you're gonna get more of a deep focus look. But basically, aperture just means how much the rings on the iris close or open. So generally, it's better. A lot of people assume it's better to have a smaller aperture, but it all depends on the look you want. It's okay to go deep focus sometimes, So ISO is basically the sensitivity of your camera to pick up light. It's not something that's done basically with your lens. It's mainly the sensor's sensitivity to light. And the higher up you get, the more grainy your footage is gonna get, basically. You generally wanna keep it lower. Like the C100, its native ISO is 800. So you wanna try to keep it in that range or even lower if you can. But when working with your camera, basically you want to try to get more work out of your aperture than what you do with your ISO. If you want a picture that's lighter or that lets in more light, try opening up your aperture more. I wouldn't really recommend upping your ISO or else you're going to get a lot of grainy footage. And since you're shooting on digital right now, you don't really want that grain. Grains kind of differs from something like film grain. It's not really something that people tend to like a lot, so try to watch out for that. From what I've seen, if you're working indoors and outdoors, you're generally gonna try to keep it lower for outdoors, but if there was one number that I'd say works okay for both, maybe around 400 ISO. That's not too high or too low in terms of ISO. Generally, I mean, like I said, outdoors you want to try to get that as low as possible. So ND filters are these it's basically like sunglasses for your camera. ND stands for neutral density, and basically what it does is allows you to stop down on your aperture and still keep that shallow depth of field. So you can still get that creamy background even when you're outdoors. If we're working on something like this outdoors, we generally want an ND filter on here so we could stop down and get a shallower depth of field on the background here. So let's say we were closer up to the subject here, we would get a shallow depth of field and we'd still get everything not blown out, basically. So the C100 has built-in ND filters, which is great, but here it is with the ND filter on. And here we are cycling through the ND filters one by one, and you can see the change in how the image looks. Get darker and darker or lighter. So your three lens types are going to be telephoto, which is from anything above I'd argue a 70. Most commonly it's known as from 50 and above, but then we also have our standards, which are 50 to 35, and our wides, which are 35 and below. So this is at 105 millimeters. It's probably really close up on my face right now. You can see all my imperfections. This is at standard at 50 now. This is most commonly the kind of range we see with our own eyes. And here's wide. So this is 24. This is probably getting a lot more of the image. So a telephoto lens will basically shorten the distance between two objects. So it'll really compress your image and make it look like, it's hard to describe, but it flattens your image basically. So someone 100 feet away will make it look like they're standing right behind me. They're just miniature or something like that. It's hard to describe. But then on the opposite end of the spectrum, if you're really wide, it makes it look like two objects are very spread apart. And so that's what's good. It's used a lot in real estate videos. It makes stuff look farther apart. So our different kind of shots are extreme close-ups, which would be something in the range that just captured a certain part of my face. So if the camera was zoomed in just to my eyes, that would qualify as an extreme close-up. Then we have a close-up, which is just from the neck up to the top of my head. So that would capture the entirety of my head. And then we have a medium close-up, which would be around the top of your chest up to the top of your head. And then from there we have the medium shot, which is from around your knees up to your top of your head. And then from there we have a long shot, which would be from the top of your head to the bottom of your feet, something that would show the entirety of your body. And from there we have extremely long shot, which would be basically your body's almost unrecognizable in how much space is surrounded by. Extremely long shots are usually used in establishing shots to get us familiar with the location. It's mainly focusing on the location that surrounds your characters, and it just gives us a sense of where we're starting off or ending a scene. So with the tripod, you can only get really static shots, but on the other hand, you can also do pan and tilts, which are movements where we move up and down or left and right on an axis though. So we can only rotate as if you were spinning around or looking up and down. So it doesn't offer too much versatility in terms of movement, but it is great if you want something stable and on sticks. Shoulder mount's great because it allows you to keep the camera right next to you while you're doing your shot. It's not the most stable option out of all the three options, but it does allow you to have some stability. It's kind of like a middle ground between the glide cam and the tripod. It still carries some movement, but it has some characteristics that some DPs like and prefer. So the glide cam's great if you're doing a lot of moving shots. It's great if you want to keep a stable, steady movement on your camera. It basically balances itself on an axis. but it's handheld also, so you can move through an environment and keep your camera on there. It's not great for doing a lot of takes. It's something that you're gonna need someone who's strong and has a lot of stamina in them. It's very consuming. So shutter speed is basically the speed at which your shutter opens and closes. You wanna make sure it's at least double of what your frame rate is. I can't really go into why that is, but basically you wanna make sure it's double, or else if you start dipping lower than that, then you'll start skipping frames, which is pretty bad, unless you want that look, which some movies have done. But for the most part, if you go above the shutter speed that's recommended, which would be 50 if you're shooting on a 24, you start to get this action kind of look. They used it for Saving Private Ryan, and they use it a lot in action movies to make it look faster, basically. So FPS stands for frames per second. Older cameras used to shoot in 16 frames per second. That's what the technology allowed, but nowadays modern films are usually shot in 24 frames per second. Modern TV shows like soap operas and stuff are shot in 30 frames per second. And sometimes the YouTube videos you see are shot in 60 frames per second or above. 24 frames per second is just what we're accustomed to when watching movies. 30 frames per second is more of a lifelike look, if you want to say. That's why they use it in soap operas and stuff. It just takes us out of the realism sometimes. And then 60 frames per second is fluid motion. Sometimes you see it in music videos, YouTube videos and stuff. If you want to shoot slow motion, you're going to be shooting in higher frames per second. So my camera here can shoot 96 frames per second, and it slows down about like 20%, which isn't much because some other cameras can shoot at 120, 180, 200, 300, even higher than that. So the higher frame rate you get, the more you can slow down the image in post for slow motion and stuff.